Robert Thompson had been counting down the days for exactly 7 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was keeping track except for the little calendar on his desk where he crossed off each day with a red pen. After 32 years of designing bridges and highways for the state, he was finally going to hang up his hard hat for good. The retirement party at the office had been nice enough. Cake, speeches, and a gold watch he'd probably never wear. But what really made his heart race was the set of keys in his pocket. Keys to his new home. Keys to his new life. Keys to 40 acres of pure heaven that he'd been dreaming about since he first saw the listing online. The drive to his new place took him down winding country roads he'd never explored before, past old barns and horses grazing in fields, past mailboxes with names he didn't recognize yet. The GPS kept telling him to turn left, then right, then left again until he started wondering if he'd somehow gotten lost. But then he saw it. The wooden sign that read Willow Creek Drive, and knew he was almost home. His house wasn't much to look at from the road. A simple 2-story farmhouse painted white with green shutters, the kind of place that had probably been someone's family home for generations before it went up for sale. But Robert wasn't buying the house for its curb appeal. He was buying it for what lay behind it. The realtor had shown him the property 3 times before he made his offer. Each time she'd saved the best part for last. They'd walk through the house, check out the rooms, and then she'd lead him out the back door. Past the small vegetable garden, past the old oak tree with the tire swing, and then they'd come to the top of the hill and Robert would see it again. The lake, it wasn't huge by any stretch. Maybe 3 acres of crystal clear water surrounded by tall pines and wild grass. A small wooden dock stretched out about 20 feet from the shore, just far enough to reach the deeper water where the fish liked to hide. The first time Robert saw it, he'd stood there for a full 5 minutes without saying a word. "Now this is the real treasure," the realtor had said with a knowing smile. "The lake comes with the property. Full fishing rights, no restrictions, no permits needed. The previous owner's family had it for over 100 years. Robert had fished since he was 8 years old. His father had taken him to lakes and rivers all over the state, teaching him which lures worked best in different seasons, how to read the water, and most importantly, how to be patient. Even during his busiest years at work, Robert always found time for weekend fishing trips. But having his own private lake? That was something he'd only dreamed about. The paperwork had been surprisingly complicated. The realtor explained that the property had some unusual features because of its age. The original land grant dated back to the 1800s, when the state was practically giving away land to anyone willing to settle in the area. Back then, if you owned property with a water source on it, you owned the water source, period. No questions asked. "It's not like buying lakefront property in a development," she'd explained as they sat in her office, signing what felt like 100 different documents. "This is different. The water rights are tied directly to your deed, has been that way since 1847. Robert had nodded along, more focused on the mental image of himself sitting on that dock with a fishing rod in his hands. Legal details weren't really his thing. He designed roads and bridges. He understood concrete and steel, not property law. As long as he could fish whenever he wanted, he was happy. The moving process had been surprisingly easy. After living in the same apartment for 15 years, Robert didn't have much stuff. His fishing gear took up more space in the moving truck than his furniture did. 12 different rods, 4 tackle boxes, 2 coolers, and a collection of lures that would make a sporting goods store jealous. His first morning in the new house, Robert was up at 5:30. Not because he had to be, but because he wanted to be. He made coffee in his new kitchen while watching the sun come up over his lake through the window. His lake. Even after 2 weeks, he still couldn't get used to saying that. He grabbed his favorite rod and a small tackle box and headed down to the dock. The morning air was cool and crisp with just a hint of mist rising off the water. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear a woodpecker working on a tree. This was exactly what he'd imagined retirement would be like. The fish were biting that morning. Robert caught 3 bass and 2 bluegill before the sun was fully up. Nothing huge, but that wasn't the point. The point was the peace, the quiet, the feeling that for the first time in decades he didn't have anywhere else he needed to be. Over the next few months, Robert settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Up at dawn, coffee and fishing until mid-morning, then breakfast and whatever projects he felt like tackling around the house. Afternoons were for reading on the porch or taking walks around his property. Evenings meant dinner and maybe some television before bed. Simple, peaceful. Perfect. He'd noticed some construction happening on the far side of the lake, but it didn't bother him much. New houses going up meant new neighbors, and Robert had always been friendly with neighbors. The construction noise only lasted during business hours, and by the time he was ready for his evening fishing, everything was quiet again. The first house to be completed was a large colonial-style home with perfectly manicured landscaping. Then came another one and another. Before long, there were 6 new houses scattered around the lake's perimeter, each one bigger and fancier than the last. Robert could see people moving in, families with kids, couples walking their dogs along the shore. It was nice in a way. The lake had been lonely with just him and the wildlife. Having other people around who appreciated the beauty of the place seemed like a good thing. Robert even waved to his new neighbors when he saw them, though none of them seemed particularly interested in waving back. He should have known that his peaceful retirement was about to get a lot more complicated. But on that perfect morning, sitting on his dock with a fishing line in the water and not a care in the world, Robert Thompson had no idea that his simple dream was about to turn into his biggest nightmare. The knock on Robert's door came at exactly 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. He knew the exact time because he'd been sitting at his kitchen table, drinking his second cup of coffee and planning his fishing strategy for the day. The knock wasn't friendly. It was sharp, demanding, and repeated 3 times before Robert could even get up from his chair. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a business magazine. Everything about her was perfectly pressed and polished, from her navy blue blazer to her matching shoes. She held a leather folder in one hand and had the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I presume?" she said, extending her free hand. "I'm Helen Crawford, president of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association. I'm afraid we need to have a conversation." Robert shook her hand, confused. Homeowners Association? He'd never heard of any homeowners association. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some mistake. I'm not part of any association." Helen's smile got a little tighter. "Oh, but you are. All property owners around Willow Lake are automatically included in our Community Standards Agreement. It was established 6 months ago for the protection and enhancement of our neighborhood." She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply walked past Robert into his living room and made herself comfortable on his couch. Robert stood in his own doorway for a moment, trying to figure out what was happening. Finally, he closed the door and joined her, though he remained standing. "Mrs. Crawford, I think you're confused. I bought this property fair and square. Nobody said anything about any homeowners association. Please call me Helen." She opened her leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "I'm afraid there's been a significant violation of our community guidelines, Mr. Thompson. We've received multiple complaints about unauthorized recreational activities on the lake." Robert blinked. "Recreational activities? You mean fishing?" "Exactly." Helen's voice was crisp and matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. "Fishing is strictly prohibited without proper permits and compliance with our environmental protection standards. The lake is a shared community resource, and all activities must be approved through the proper channels." "Shared?" Robert felt his blood pressure starting to rise. "Ma'am, I hate to break it to you, but this is my lake. It came with my property. I can fish here whenever I want." Helen actually laughed at that. Not a pleasant laugh, but the kind of sound someone makes when they think you've said something particularly foolish. "Mr. Thompson, no one person can own a lake. Bodies of water are community resources. That's basic environmental law." She pulled out another set of papers from her folder. "This is your official citation for violation of HOA Regulation 47B regarding unauthorized use of community water resources. The fine is $500 payable within 30 days. Additionally, you'll be assessed a daily penalty of $50 for each day the violation continues." Robert stared at the papers she was holding out to him. The words seemed to swim on the page. $500? For fishing in his own lake? This is crazy. You can't fine me for using my own property." "I'm afraid I can, and I am." Helen stood up and placed the citation on his coffee table. "The Lakeshore Estates HOA has full authority to enforce community standards within our jurisdiction. Every homeowner in the development signed an agreement acknowledging these rules. But I don't live in any development." Robert's voice was getting louder now. "I bought this property before any of those houses were even built." Helen's expression softened slightly, but not in a sympathetic way. more like a teacher talking to a particularly slow student. Mr. Thompson, I understand this might be confusing for you, but the fact is, we now have a thriving community around this lake. 6 beautiful homes, 12 families, and more development planned. We can't have random people treating our shared resources like their personal playground. Random people. This is my home. Yes, and as a member of our community, you have responsibilities. She pulled out yet another document. These are our community guidelines. Lake use is restricted to approved activities during designated hours. Fishing requires an environmental impact assessment and a recreational use permit. The application process takes approximately 60 days. Robert took the papers just so he could see what insanity he was dealing with. The document was 12 pages long and written in the kind of legal language that made his head hurt. Phrases like environmental sustainability protocols and community aesthetic standards jumped out at him. This is ridiculous, he said, flipping through the pages. I've been fishing this lake for 6 months. Haven't heard anything or anyone. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Helen pulled out her phone and showed him a series of photos. Pictures of Robert sitting on his dock. Pictures of him casting his line. Pictures of him carrying a string of fish back to his house. These photos were taken by concerned residents who felt your activities were disruptive to the peaceful enjoyment of the lake environment. Robert couldn't believe what he was seeing. Someone was taking pictures of me? On my own property? On community property, Helen corrected. And yes, several residents have expressed concerns. Mrs. Patterson finds your early morning fishing disruptive to her yoga routine. The Hendersons feel that removing fish from the lake damages the ecosystem, and the Johnsons are concerned about the noise. What noise? Fishing is about the quietest activity in the world. Helen pointed to one of the photos. Your tackle box. The clicking sounds when you open and close it. Very disruptive during the morning quiet hours. Robert sat down heavily in his chair. This couldn't be real. He had to be having some kind of weird dream. Mrs. Crawford, I think you need to understand something. I own this property. I own this lake. I have the deed to prove it. Mr. Thompson, I've been dealing with property disputes for 15 years. Trust me when I tell you that no individual can own an entire lake. It's simply not how property law works. She gathered up her papers and stood to leave. The citation stands. You have 30 days to pay the fine and cease all unauthorized lake activities. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties and possible legal action. She headed toward the door, then turned back with that same cold smile. Oh, and Mr. Thompson, we're planning a community lake cleanup day next Saturday. If you'd like to participate as a good neighbor, we start at 9 a.m. sharp. Volunteers are always welcome. After she left, Robert sat in his living room staring at the citation. $500 for fishing in his own lake. He read through the community guidelines, getting angrier with each page. Apparently, he wasn't allowed to use unauthorized watercraft on the lake. His little rowboat was now illegal. He couldn't have fires near the water, couldn't play music outdoors, and couldn't even feed the ducks without a permit. The phone number for the HOA was at the bottom of the citation. Robert dialed it, ready to give someone a piece of his mind. A cheerful recorded voice informed him that his call was important and that someone would get back to him within 48 hours. He tried calling the county office next. Maybe they could explain this nonsense to Mrs. Crawford. After being transferred 4 times, he finally reached someone in the property records department. Sir, homeowners associations can establish rules for their developments, the clerk explained. If the property is within their jurisdiction, they do have enforcement authority. But I'm not in their development. I was here first. That's more complicated. You'd probably need to speak with a lawyer about property boundaries and water rights. A lawyer? Robert had never needed a lawyer in his life. He hung up the phone and walked outside to his dock. The lake was perfectly calm, reflecting the morning sky like a mirror. In the distance, he could see one of his new neighbors watering her garden. She looked up at him and quickly looked away. For 32 years, Robert had followed the rules. He'd paid his taxes, obeyed traffic laws, and never caused trouble for anyone. All he wanted was to spend his retirement fishing in peace. But apparently, even that simple dream was too much to ask for. He cast his line into the water, knowing that each minute he sat there was costing him another $50 according to Mrs. Crawford's math. The fish weren't biting, but that wasn't the point anymore. This was his lake, his dock, and his retirement. If the HOA wanted a fight, they'd picked the wrong old engineer to mess with. Robert spent the next 3 days doing something he'd never done in his entire life: reading legal documents. Not just skimming through them, but actually reading every single word, even the parts written in tiny print that hurt his eyes. He had boxes of paperwork from when he bought the house, and he was determined to find something that would prove Helen Crawford wrong. His kitchen table looked like a tornado had hit it. Property deeds, survey maps, title insurance documents, and mortgage papers were scattered everywhere. Robert had even driven to the county courthouse to get copies of historical records. The clerk there, a friendly woman named Betty, had been more helpful than anyone at the HOA office. "Water rights can be tricky," she'd said, pulling out a thick folder marked with his property address, especially with older properties. "Let me see what we've got here." What they had was interesting, very interesting. The original land grant for Robert's property was dated 1847. Back then, the state was practically giving away land to anyone willing to settle in the wilderness and make it productive. The document was written in old-fashioned language that was hard to understand. But one thing was crystal clear: whoever owned the property owned everything on it, including all water sources, springs, creeks, ponds, and lakes contained within the described boundaries. Robert had read that sentence at least 20 times. All water sources. That included his lake, but he wasn't taking any chances. He'd called 3 different lawyers, and all 3 had said the same thing. Water rights were complicated, and he needed someone who specialized in property law. The lawyer he finally hired, David Park, had been practicing real estate law for 20 years and had dealt with HOA disputes before. "These neighborhood associations can be pretty aggressive," David had warned during their first meeting. "They've got their own lawyers, and they're used to homeowners backing down rather than fighting. But let me take a look at your documents. That was 2 days ago." Today, David was coming to Robert's house to walk the property and explain what he'd found. Robert had barely slept the night before, partly from excitement and partly from worry. Legal fees weren't cheap, and Robert was living on a fixed income now. But he couldn't let the HOA walk all over him. David arrived right on time, carrying a briefcase and wearing boots suitable for walking around the property. He was younger than Robert had expected, probably in his 40s, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that came from knowing his stuff. "Good news first or bad news first?" David asked as they shook hands. "Let's start with the good news. You own the lake. No question about it. The original land grant is ironclad, and water rights transfer with the property deed. I've traced the ownership back 175 years, and it's been consistent the whole time. This lake is 100% yours." Robert felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "And the bad news? The HOA doesn't care. They're going to argue that their authority supersedes individual property rights within their jurisdiction. They'll claim that community standards apply to everyone, regardless of who owns what." They walked down to the lake while David explained the legal situation. It was more complicated than Robert had hoped, but not as bad as he'd feared. The HOA had the right to establish rules for their development, but they didn't have the right to control Robert's private property. "The problem is that they're betting you won't fight back," David said as they reached the dock. "Most people get a legal-sounding letter and just pay the fine. It's easier than going to court." "Well, they bet wrong," Robert said firmly. "This is my retirement. I worked 32 years to afford this place." David pulled out a survey map and spread it on the dock. "Here's what we know for sure. Your property boundary extends to here, here, and here." He pointed to various landmarks around the lake. "The entire lake is within your boundary. But look at this." Robert leaned over the map. David was pointing to the area where the new houses had been built. "See how their lots come right up to the water's edge? They all have docks and waterfront access. So what does that mean?" "It means they've been using your property without permission. Every one of those docks is built over your lake bottom. Every time they swim or boat or fish, they're trespassing on your private property." Robert stared at the map, trying to process what David was telling him. "Are you saying all my neighbors are breaking the law?" "Technically, yes, though they probably don't know it. The developer who sold them those lots likely told them they had lake access. But lake access and lake ownership are 2 different things." They spent the next hour walking the entire shoreline, while David took photos and measurements. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only did Robert own the lake, but he also owned the lake bottom extending well beyond the original shoreline. Several of the new docks were built on stilts driven into his property. "This is actually perfect," David said as they finished their walk. The HOA overplayed their hand. They're trying to fine you for using your own property, while their members are actually trespassing on it. Back at the house, David spread out all the documents on Robert's kitchen table. Property deeds, survey maps, historical records, and legal precedents. It looked impressive and intimidating at the same time. "Here's what I recommend," David said. "First, we send a formal response to their citation, explaining that you own the lake and have every right to fish there. We include copies of all the relevant documents. That'll get their attention. Will that make them back down? Probably not. They'll likely double down and threaten more legal action. That's when we play our trump card." David pulled out a fresh legal document he'd prepared. "This is a cease and desist letter to all the property owners with docks on your lake. We demand immediate removal of all unauthorized structures and payment for past trespass damages." Robert's eyes widened. "You want me to sue my neighbors? I want you to make the HOA understand that they're not the only ones who can play hardball. When their members realize they might lose their lake access because of the HOA's actions, the pressure will shift to the association to settle." It was a bold strategy, but Robert liked it. He'd spent his career solving engineering problems, and this felt like just another puzzle to figure out. The HOA thought they could intimidate a quiet retiree into paying their ridiculous fines. They were about to learn that Robert Thompson wasn't as easy to push around as they thought. "What about the other neighbors?" Robert asked. "The ones who complained about my fishing?" David smiled. "Well, Mrs. Patterson's yoga routine might be disrupted when she realizes her morning meditation spot is on private property she doesn't have permission to use. And the Hendersons' concern about the ecosystem might take a backseat to wondering if they'll still have a waterfront view." They spent another hour going over the legal strategy. David would handle all the paperwork and court filings if it came to that. Robert's job was to keep fishing and document any further harassment from the HOA. "One more thing," David said as he packed up his briefcase. "Don't let them intimidate you. Property rights are fundamental in this country. You're not asking for anything unreasonable. You just want to use your own land the way you see fit." After David left, Robert walked back down to his dock. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the water, and he could see a few of his neighbors working in their yards. One of them, a man he'd never met, was standing on his dock and seemed to be staring in Robert's direction. Robert gave him a friendly wave. The man didn't wave back. Tomorrow, David would send the formal response to the HOA. By the end of the week, every neighbor with a dock would receive their cease and desist letter. Robert had no idea how they'd react, but he was pretty sure his quiet retirement was about to get a lot more interesting. He cast his line into the water and settled in for some evening fishing. For the first time since Helen Crawford's visit, Robert felt like himself again. The fish were biting, the sunset was beautiful, and he was exactly where he belonged. On his own property, doing exactly what he wanted to do. The HOA had picked a fight with the wrong engineer. The Lakeshore Estates HOA meeting was held in the community center of the newest development, a building that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a neighborhood meeting hall. Robert had never been inside before, and he was surprised by how fancy everything was. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and leather furniture that probably cost more than his first car. Helen Crawford stood at the front of the room behind a podium, looking every bit as polished as she had when she'd shown up at his door. About 30 people filled the chairs facing her, and Robert recognized several of them as his lakefront neighbors. The mood in the room felt tense, like everyone was waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Robert took a seat in the back row, his briefcase full of legal documents on the floor beside him. David Park had wanted to come with him, but Robert had insisted on handling this himself. Sometimes, one neighbor talking to another worked better than lawyers throwing papers at each other. "Before we begin tonight's regular business," Helen announced, "we need to address a serious matter concerning community property rights. As many of you know, we've been dealing with an individual who refuses to respect our lake use guidelines." Several heads turned to look at Robert. He gave them a polite nod. "Mr. Thompson has not only ignored our citation," Helen continued, "but his lawyer has sent threatening letters to several of our members. This kind of harassment is exactly why we have community standards in the first place." A woman Robert didn't recognize raised her hand. "What kind of threatening letters?" Helen's expression grew grim. "Legal documents claiming that our docks are somehow illegal, demanding payment for what they call trespass damages, It's clearly an attempt to intimidate our residents into dropping their legitimate complaints about unauthorized fishing activities. Robert had heard enough. He stood up, briefcase in hand. "Mrs. Crawford, may I respond to those accusations?" The room went quiet. Helen looked like she'd rather have a root canal than let Robert speak. But with 30 people watching, she couldn't very well refuse. "You have 3 minutes, Mr. Thompson." "Thank you." Robert walked to the front of the room and set his briefcase on a nearby table. "First, I want everyone to know that I never intended to cause problems for anyone. I bought my property because I wanted a quiet place to fish in my retirement. That's all I've ever wanted." He opened his briefcase and pulled out the survey map David had prepared. It was enlarged and laminated, with bright red lines showing the property boundaries. "But I think there's been some confusion about who owns what around here." Helen stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, this is neither the time nor the place for—" "Actually, it's exactly the time and place," Robert interrupted calmly. "Because everyone in this room deserves to know the truth about the lake." He held up the map so everyone could see it. "This is an official survey of my property, prepared by a licensed surveyor and verified by the county records office. The red line shows my property boundary. As you can see, the entire lake is within that boundary." Murmurs started spreading through the room. Robert could see people leaning forward in their chairs trying to get a better look at the map. "That's impossible," said a man in the front row. "The developer told us we had lake access rights." "You do have access rights," Robert replied. "But access rights and ownership are different things. I own the lake. You have the right to use it, assuming you're doing so legally." Helen's face was turning red. "Mr. Thompson, this is a community meeting, not a courtroom. Your lawyer can present whatever documents he wants through proper legal channels." Robert pulled out another document from his briefcase. The original land grant from 1847, now professionally photocopied and enlarged. This might interest everyone. It's the original property deed from when this land was first settled. It specifically grants ownership of all water sources, springs, creeks, ponds, and lakes contained within the described boundaries. The room was completely silent now. Robert could see people looking at each other with worried expressions. "Now I want to be clear about something," Robert continued. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone or take away your lake access, but I am trying to protect my right to fish on my own property without being fined for it." A woman near the middle of the room raised her hand. "If you own the lake, does that mean our docks are—" "Technically, yes, they're on my property," Robert said gently. "But like I said, I'm not looking to cause trouble. I just want to fish in peace." Helen finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. Even if you do own some portion of the lake bottom, you can't control how the water is used. Water rights are public domain." Robert had been hoping she'd say something like that. He pulled out one more document, this one with an official seal at the bottom. "This is a legal opinion from Park & Associates, a law firm that specializes in property rights. Would you like me to read the relevant section?" Without waiting for an answer, Robert put on his reading glasses. "According to state law, ownership of a lake bottom includes exclusive rights to control all activities on the water surface above it, including but not limited to fishing, boating, swimming, and the installation of structures such as docks or piers." The murmuring in the room was getting louder. Robert could hear people having whispered conversations with their neighbors. "Furthermore," Robert continued reading, "any structures built on private lake bottom without owner permission constitute trespass, regardless of whether the structure owners were aware of the property boundaries." Helen grabbed the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please don't be intimidated by scare tactics. This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior our HOA was created to prevent. One person trying to control resources that benefit the entire community." "Mrs. Crawford," Robert said, his voice still calm and steady, "I'm not trying to control anything. I'm just asking for the same thing every property owner in America expects. The right to use my own land without being fined for it." He looked around the room at all the worried faces. "Here's what I propose. The HOA withdraws its citation and stops interfering with my fishing. In return, I'll work with everyone to establish reasonable guidelines for shared lake use. No one loses their dock, no one gets sued, and we all get along like good neighbors should." A man in the second row stood up. "And if the HOA doesn't agree to that?" Robert closed his briefcase and picked it up. "Then my lawyer will file suit on Monday morning for trespass damages going back to when the first dock was built. According to our research, that would be about 4 years ago." He estimates the total damage is at roughly $200,000. The room erupted. People were talking loudly, some standing up, others waving papers in the air. Helen was banging a gavel and trying to restore order, but nobody was paying attention to her anymore. Robert walked toward the exit, but stopped at the door and turned back. "Mrs. Crawford, you have my phone number. I'll be fishing tomorrow morning as usual. You can reach me there." As he left the building, Robert could hear angry voices through the windows. People were demanding answers, wanting to know what this meant for their property values, asking if they needed their own lawyers. Helen Crawford's voice rose above the others, trying to maintain control of a meeting that had clearly gotten away from her. Robert drove home through the dark country roads, feeling better than he had in weeks. He'd played his hand exactly the way David had suggested. No threats, no anger, just facts and reasonable solutions. The ball was in the HOA's court now. But somehow Robert suspected that Helen Crawford wasn't the type to back down gracefully. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. Robert's phone started ringing at 6:30 the next morning. He was already up, making coffee and getting ready for his usual fishing routine when the first call came in. He didn't recognize the number, so he let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again and again. By the time he'd finished his first cup of coffee, he had 7 missed calls and 4 voicemails. The messages were all from his neighbors, and they all wanted the same thing: answers. "Mr. Thompson, this is Jerry Henderson from across the lake. Could you please call me back? I think we need to talk about this dock situation. Hi, this is Patricia Johnson. My husband and I are very concerned about what happened at the meeting last night. Can we work something out? Mr. Thompson, this is Tom Patterson. Look, I don't want any trouble. Can we sit down and figure this out like reasonable people?" Robert listened to all the messages while he gathered his fishing gear. These were the same people who had complained about his fishing just a week ago. The same people who had supported the HOA's citation. Now they were singing a very different tune. His phone rang again as he was walking down to the dock. This time he recognized the number. "Helen Crawford, Mr. Thompson." Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "I think you should know that your little performance last night has caused quite an uproar in our community." "Good morning, Mrs. Crawford," Robert said pleasantly. "Beautiful day for fishing, isn't it? This isn't a joke. I've had 12 calls from homeowners demanding to know if their lake access is in jeopardy. Property values could be affected. People are talking about hiring their own lawyers." Robert set up his fishing chair on the dock and started organizing his tackle box. "Well, that's unfortunate. All of this could have been avoided if you'd just let me fish in peace. You're not the only person who lives around this lake, Mr. Thompson. We have a responsibility to all our residents, not just to one stubborn old man who thinks he owns everything. I don't think I own everything. Mrs. Crawford, just what's legally mine according to 175 years of property records. There's a difference." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Helen spoke again, her voice was different. Less aggressive, more calculating. "What exactly do you want?" Robert cast his line into the water before answering. "Same thing I've wanted from the beginning. To fish on my own property without being harassed. To live quietly and peacefully in my retirement. To be treated like a neighbor instead of a criminal. And in return? In return, your residents can keep their docks and lake access and nobody gets sued for trespass." Another pause. "I'll need to discuss this with our legal counsel." "Take your time," Robert said. "I'll be right here." She hung up without saying goodbye. Robert smiled and settled in to enjoy his morning fishing. The fish were biting better than they had in weeks, as if they sensed that the drama was finally coming to an end. Over the next few hours, Robert had visitors. Jerry Henderson was the first to arrive, walking nervously down the hill from his house with his hands in his pockets. "Mr. Thompson, could we talk for a minute?" Robert reeled in his line and turned around. "Sure, Jerry, what's on your mind?" "Look, I want to apologize for supporting the HOA complaint. I honestly thought they knew what they were talking about. If I had known you owned the lake..." "Don't worry about it," Robert said. "You were just trying to protect your investment." "I understand that," Jerry looked relieved. "So where do we go from here?" "I mean, my dock? It cost me $8,000 to have it built." "Your dock is fine, Jerry. I'm not interested in tearing down anyone's dock. I just want to fish without being fined for it." "But legally, you could make me remove it, right?" Robert looked across the lake at Jerry's dock. It was a nice one, built with quality materials and clearly designed to last. "Jerry, I spent 32 years building things for the state. Roads, bridges, structures that people depend on. I don't like tearing things down unless I have to. The relief on Jerry's face was obvious. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Just do me a favor, Robert said. When the HOA calls their next meeting, remember who was being reasonable and who was trying to cause problems. By lunchtime, Robert had similar conversations with 3 other neighbors. Patricia Johnson brought him a plate of homemade cookies and an apology. Tom Patterson offered to help with any maintenance work around Robert's property. Even the woman who had complained about his tackle box making noise stopped by to say she'd been hasty in her judgment. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. A silver Mercedes pulled up in front of Robert's house and a man in an expensive suit got out. He was carrying a briefcase and had the confident walk of someone who was used to being the smartest person in the room. Mr. Thompson, I'm Richard Hayes, legal counsel for the Lakeshore Estates HOA. I was hoping we could have a conversation. Robert invited him inside and offered him coffee, which the lawyer politely declined. They sat at Robert's kitchen table, the same place where all this had started when Helen Crawford had delivered her citation. I'll be direct with you, Mr. Thompson, Hayes said, opening his briefcase. I've reviewed your property documents and they appear to be legitimate. You do indeed own the lake and the lake bottom. I appreciate your honesty. However, Hayes continued, this puts us in a difficult position. Our residents purchased their homes with the understanding that they had permanent lake access. If that access is suddenly in jeopardy, it doesn't have to be in jeopardy, Robert interrupted. I've told Mrs. Crawford and several of your residents that I'm willing to work out reasonable arrangements. Hayes pulled out a legal document from his briefcase. We've prepared a formal agreement. It grants permanent lake access rights to all current lakefront property owners in exchange for the HOA, withdrawing its citation and paying your legal fees. Robert read through the document carefully. It was written in legal language, but the basic terms were fair. The HOA would officially recognize his ownership of the lake, drop all fines and penalties, and pay David Park's legal fees, which had reached almost $3,000. In return, Robert would grant permanent easements for all existing docks and reasonable lake use rights for all lakefront properties. This looks reasonable, Robert said, but I want one addition. What's that? A clause stating that any future disputes about lake use will be resolved through direct negotiation between me and the affected property owners. No more HOA intermediaries. Hayes smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. I think we can agree to that. The signing took place the following week in David Park's office. Helen Crawford was there, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The 6 lakefront property owners were there too, all looking relieved to have the matter settled. Robert signed his name with the same pen he'd used to mark off the days until his retirement. Well, David said as they shook hands afterward, that was easier than I expected. Sometimes the threat of a big stick is more effective than actually using it, Robert replied. Helen Crawford approached him as everyone was leaving. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that this was never personal. I was just trying to do what I thought was best for the community. Robert nodded. I understand, Mrs. Crawford, but next time, maybe check the property records before you start writing citations. 6 months later, Robert's morning fishing routine was exactly what it had been before the whole mess started. He was up at dawn, coffee in hand, walking down to his dock while the mist was still rising off the water. The only difference was that he now had company sometimes. Jerry Henderson had taken up fishing and often joined him in the early mornings. Patricia Johnson's grandkids liked to watch him cast his line when they visited. The HOA still existed, but they focused on things like neighborhood landscaping standards and snow removal schedules. They left lake management to Robert, who had proven to be a much more reasonable authority than they'd expected. Robert kept the original citation framed on his office wall, right next to his retirement certificate from the State Highway Department. Sometimes visitors would ask about it, and Robert would tell them the story of how he'd fought City Hall and won. But mostly he just enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he'd stood up for his rights and won. The lake was still his. The fish were still biting. And his retirement was exactly what he'd dreamed it would be. Peaceful, quiet, and free from anyone telling him what he could or couldn't do on his own property. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when you're standing on solid ground. And when it comes to property rights, Robert Thompson had discovered, There's no ground more solid than a 175-year-old deed that says, "The lake is yours."